We're now going to continue on with the rigging process for the robot and go through quite a few things that need to be corrected or fixed in order to get this to work. So the first thing I'm going to do is, in the previous video, when this was being created, I noticed that the joint was not lining up exactly. It was kind of tilted through the creation process. So what I can do is, under the attribute editor for that joint, I can come down to the joint orientation and I can actually flatten that out and make sure it is going in the direction that I want it to be. I can also come to this bottom one and do the same thing, make sure that's exactly 90, or because it's an end joint, I can just zero everything out if I want to. But in that way, I can make sure that things are lined up. So if you notice that things go askew during the creation process, you can adjust things from there. Now, the next thing I'm going to point out is that I've currently got an issue with this leg. If this type of a robot were ever handed to someone doing rigging on a project in an actual studio, it would immediately be sent back to the artists who created it and back to the art lead to figure out how to solve this, because we have a problem. The idea with creating a rig is so that you make the animator's life easier. And you want to make sure that it helps support that ability to do so. And so for a leg, we want to make sure that we can put an IK handle on this and have it work correctly. But as I will show right now, if I put on an IK handle to this leg, when I move it up and down, instead of the knee bending forward, you see that it bends out to the side. So on a regular model, it would be in line on top of itself, or even if the legs are going out, it would still be fairly in line with itself, but then the knee would be coming forward. Otherwise, you get this kind of movement, which it doesn't really support what we want from this robot. So there are a couple of ways to approach this. One, let me step back just a little bit. A little bit further. Okay, there. One thing we could do is to not do anything, and then we can just manually animate it, which is not really helpful for your animators or for the motion of this. Another is to do single joint IK handles. But this really is not much more of an improvement over what you would be getting in, with anything else. So yeah, I can use that and move it into place, but it really doesn't help my animators. So I'll step back before that. So really what I need to do is find a way to get this to line up. There are a few different ways you could do this, but the easiest way would actually be to adjust the model, adjust the geometry, and rig this in such a way that things can be lined up. And so, for example, with this one, I would definitely want this to be coming forward just a little bit, and this one to be coming back. And that helps me a little bit. So now if I do an IK handle between this, I lift up and it is going forward, but it's also sticking out a little bit. And so if I did something like having a locator on here, I can grab those. Make sure I'm in the rigging portion and do constrain pull vector. Then if I move that locator here off to the side, if I grab the IK handle and not the joint, then it kind of works. But if you're noticing, there's also a lot of popping and things like that as it's trying to figure out exactly how and where to move. So it still has that awkward bowing that is not exactly what we want. There's also some twisting going on here. So that's an option, but it's still not the best option. The best we can do is actually to adjust the model so that it will line up in line with itself to be able to work. So I can do that either by bending the bottom of the leg and bringing this foot out, or bringing everything more in line, which is actually more how our legs work, where the femur will actually come in a little bit. And so if I want to do that, what I can do is I can use this. If I grab these faces, I'm going to double click these faces. And I want that to line up exactly in the center of that joint. So I will hold down the V key, bring this in, and use that point that I had already created. Do the same thing here, and I'll snap this to the top of that one so that I know that it's lined up right in the center. Actually, I can even use this as a guide right here. There we go. And then with this one, what I can do is I will hit the D key with those faces selected. Holding down V for snap to point, I will adjust this pivot for the face selection right to the middle there. And then I will rotate. But I don't want it to just be random. I want to make sure that I'm getting it the same on this side as I will get it on the other side. So I'll open up the modeling toolkit. And I will turn snap step on. And I will set that to 15 just to try it out. So that'll be 1. Nope, that's too far. So let's try like 6. Too far. But this allows me to be a lot more exact with it. So let me do 4. And that feels much better. That puts it right in the middle there. So now I'm going to do the same thing the other side. I will select that. And unfortunately, right now, I don't have any way of getting that pivot to exactly the center, which is where I need it. So what I can do instead is I need to start by coming back over to the poly modeling. Once again, I will hold shift so I can snap that right in the center. And I could do just a vertice, but by having the edge there, it reminds me to remove that. Go back to the selection. Adjust the pivot. So D key, V key up here, V key over here, and then I can snap that in, those 4 degrees. Select this, and I will, holding down the V key, snap that right to the center. And holding this, I will snap that right to the center. And you see there's a little bit of overlap, so this is going to create some other problems with our weight painting, but those are things that we can resolve later. And we can actually, once we have this leg set up, move this back into position and be able to adjust things as we need to. But I want to get this rig set up in a way that it's going to better support what we want to have happen. So in this way, I'm going to grab this joint. Got object mode really fast. Grab this joint right here. Holding the V key, I will snap this in. V key, snap this in. And I also need to move this forward just a little bit, because that way it knows which direction it's going to bend in. It doesn't need to be this far. So for example, with this leg, let me bring this back just a touch. As long as it's forward even the slightest bit. So I can snap this, holding down snap to point to the center, and I just need it to come forward a little bit. So not much. And then I can grab the face here again, and I'm going to snap that forward to this joint, and then I can grab this face and snap that forward using the other one as a guide. So I'll snap to the top of that. So it is slightly forward, but it allows me the movement that I need. So now if I do an IK handle on that, come over here to the rigging menu and drop an IK handle on. You see now I can get that nice motion in the leg that I'm looking for. So this is a problem that you may run into in the future, and I want to make you aware of it, that there are times where you may need to adjust the model to better support the rig, or times where you may have to sacrifice something in the rig to keep something on a model, but it's a decision that has to be made with the animators in mind, as well as the final look that you're going for the model. In the same way, right now, if I dropped an IK handle on here, there is no guarantee of how this would work. As you can see, by having this all lined up straight, in older versions of Maya, it would just simply lock up. And so this became a problem. In the version now, it forces the movement with that IK handle, but it doesn't always go in the direction you want. And so we want to be able to control that. And so in order to get that to work, I know that I want the elbow to go backwards, so I need to drop this back just a little bit. Doesn't have to be a lot, just a little bit does it. Bring this one forward, so snap that back into the point. And then for this piece of the arm, just so I make sure it's located in the very center of that ball joint, I will snap it to the center of that joint. And you see there's a slight offset, but that's a minor sacrifice in order to get the joints to be able to work correctly. So now if I come through and I drop in the IK handle, aha, and you see I still had a problem. So let's talk about that. The next step with this is actually getting things oriented in the right direction. And so we're going to approach that right now. So with each of these joints, there's a specific orientation that you need to be following. In general, the x-axis, which if you look down here in the bottom left again, the XYZ, the x-axis is the red one, should point down the joint chain, regardless of the direction. So in this case, the joint chain is going up, but it's still, so in world space it's going up, but this is going down the chain from parent to child. And if you'll notice, because of the way it was built, the x-axis is already pointing to the next joint in the chain. And then the other axes are pointing in the direction that they can. Because the x-axis is going up, the y-axis cannot go up, and so it's the z-axis that's coming forward. And it doesn't really matter which one you have as the secondary axis, but the thing is it needs to be consistent across the board. So some riggers have, specific ways that they like to set it up, but as long as they're all the same, then there's not a problem. If these are different, what'll happen is as you try and move something, for example, if I grab multiple joints at the same time and I rotate those, you see those are all going in the same direction. But if one of those axes is off, then it will get a weird twist or a turn or have other problems. And right now this is not lined up exact. Because of the movement of this joint up here, even though it's slight, this is no longer lined up with where it needs to be. So what I'm going to do is I am going to make sure that things are pointing down the joint chain. So for like these end joints, I'm going to open up the attribute editor. I want to zero those out. That's zeroed. That's zeroed, so I'm all good there. I'm actually going to come back, and I know that these are already lined up in the direction that I want them to go. So everything is actually lined up with world space on these, and it makes my life easier, so I can do that. But I don't want those to be affected necessarily based on, well, you know what, I'll just go with it. All right, so right now I'm going to say that I want the x-axis to go down the chain. I want the y-axis to be my secondary axis so that everything lines up kind of the way I want it to right here. So the way I can do that to make sure that it gets adjusted where it needs to be is if I select that top joint and I come to skeleton, skeleton orient joint. Sorry, it went off there for a second. Before I actually do that, so skeleton orient joint, and I select that checkbox, I can tell it how I want it to go. So if you watch these axes right here, if I'm going to set it up so I have the primary axis on X, secondary axis on Y, and secondary axis world orientation. I'll take that Actually, I'll leave that on Y for now. And I will hit apply. Then that will adjust. Like right now you can't really see it because there wasn't much of a change, but let's try this. So if I do Y and Z and then hit apply, as you can see, those axes change. Now the x-axis is coming forward, the y-axis is going down the chain, the z-axis is going up. And so I'm going to move that back and hit apply, and that gets things lined up. After that axis is set, and you can see that that Y orientation has changed just a little bit, you may have to make changes. So I can middle mouse, or excuse me, you can control and right mouse drag in one of these fields to change joint orientation. Now you need to be careful with this because, for example, if I'm doing this, it actually will change the whole chain. So I'll step back. But if I need something to be adjusted or twisted, I can actually do that here. And so if there needs to be a different type of a twist, I can manually change how a joint would work. Now the best way to do this so I don't have all of these additional issues is to unparent this first. So if I shift P to unparent that child from the parent, and then I can come back and make that twist that I need to get things to work right, and then select the child, parent, hit P to connect them. But what happens is that allows me to have more freedom, it allows me to have more control, so you can make manual adjustments if there's something that's not working by doing it through the default way. So once again, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to orient it so that everything's worked out. I also want to make sure that I freeze the transforms. In the same way you did on the mesh, joints can actually have their transforms change. For example, like the rotate could be different based on what I'm doing. In these cases it's not, because I had built it fairly clean. But what'll happen is it will take into account the rotation and put everything under the joint orientation when you freeze it. So I can select these and go modify, freeze transforms. And it will do that. If you notice the translate though, when you freeze the transforms on a joint, the translate does not change because it needs that information in relative world space. Alright. So with this, as you can see, we have a lot of different things going on. But even as we go down the chain, this has now oriented itself from the thumb to the end of the thumb, and everything else is lined up the way we need it to be. The leg, on the other hand, is still fairly off. It's gotten a little bit better, but as you can see, it's not quite where it was. Right now, it's going straight down, where before it was slightly to the side. And so we're going to work on that and make sure that things line up the way that they need to. So grabbing this, once again, we will go orient joints. And in this case with the leg, I actually, because the y-axis is out, I actually want to focus on the z-axis as my primary axis. And I will hit apply. And as you can see, it was able to orient itself. There was that little bit of a shift. So that now everything should be lined up and working correctly. There should be a little bit of an adjustment. So when I come in, you can see the x-axis is now pointing down towards the ankle. The ankle is pointing out towards the end of the foot. And by the way, right now the ankle is large, so once again, if I want to just have a visual change, I can come to this radius and lower that down to something like a 1. And so in this way, my orientation is working through the form now. There are other ways of making sure that things are lined up exactly the way you want them to go, such as using locators and doing something like aim constraint axis for an individual joint, making sure it's going down the chain and in the right direction. But for right now, since this is just an introduction to all of this, we won't delve into it too very deeply. I just want you to be aware that there are a lot of things that are much more advanced. So for right now, let's move on to the next step of the cleanup process, which is naming. if I open up the outliner, you can see that there's my mesh and there's my joints, and these can become kind of overwhelming when they're not named. So it's very important that you somehow name all of these. And so I can either do it from the outliner, or in this case I'm just going to grab a joint at a time. Call that the origin, chest, neck, head, sorry, I had some catching there, and so want to make sure that those are still named. Head underscore end, shoulder, elbow, wrist. And by the way I pop in there is I hit F for focus, and that'll focus in on specific things. All right. Finger 1, finger 2, finger end, or excuse me, finger 1 end. Let me go back and correct this. 1, 1, 1, 2. And then I'll follow that same naming convention. So finger 2, 1, finger 2, 2, finger 2, end. Thumb 1, or actually I'll just do thumb because there's only the one joint, and thumb end, okay, hip, knee, ankle, foot, end. Okay. Now this is okay because these are all named. So let me go to the window outliner, and you'll see now it makes a lot more sense. So I'm better able to understand where things are. So even as I go down to the fingers, you can see the hierarchy, and everything's got a name, so I understand what things are and where they belong. The problem is I'm going to have those same names again. If I have shoulder, well, on the other side, that's going to be called shoulder as well. And so that doesn't really help me. So what I need to do is make sure that this is going to work for what I need to have happen. And by the way, I got the bottom of the legs lined up, but I never actually moved this one over, the section of elbow here. So I need to make sure to, holding down V, snap to the end of here so that it has that slight offset as well. So making sure that things are the same on both sides. But anyway, back to this. What I want to point out right now is that I need some way of defining this section of the rig as opposed to the one that's going to be on the other side. And so the way I can do that is by adding a prefix to it. So I could come through and do it one at a time, like L underscore. And the reason I do L underscore rather than just L is because well, you'll see in a second. It allows me, when I mirror the joints across the object, to do it a little easier. But if I did that one at a time, it would take quite a while. So instead, I will grab this top joint of this chain for the leg, And I can even shift select, grab that top joint of this chain for the arm, and come up to modify prefix hierarchy names, and I will do L underscore and hit OK. And now all of these have that L underscore so that the prefix is there. The next step for this is now to duplicate the geometry across to the other side. So I will take this, and by grabbing the shoulder, I don't want to grab in the center and duplicate over, because then, as you can see, it'll have more information than I want to go. I just want this part, and it will respect what the parent is. So I can go skeleton, mirror joints, and I'm going to open up the option box. And I need to figure out where I'm mirroring across. So XY is actually, if I look at the X and Y axis, that is the plane that separates across here that would be front to back. If I do that and hit apply, you see it just creates another one there. But so that's not the direction I want to go. So I Control Z and step back. I actually want to go across the YZ axis. So with the X so that it flips over. So YZ, set it for behavior. And then down here I want to search for L underscore. Once again, it's that prefix name. And the reason we do this is because if I just put the L, then in places like elbow, it'll change it to elbow. Change that L to an R. By having the L underscore, then it defines it just as that prefix that's there. And I will change it to R underscore. And I will hit apply. And so now you can see where that's L underscore shoulder. This is R underscore shoulder. And it does it the whole way down. And the same thing with the hip. I'm going to just hit apply again. And it will do the same thing. Now it's R, hip, knee, ankle, foot. And so everything is set up in the way that it needs to be. The final thing I need to do is, if you notice that axis orientation is not where it needs to be at the moment. So what I can do is I can make sure that these have their transforms frozen. So once again, modify, freeze transforms, making sure that all this rotate information shifts down to the joint orientation. Rather than being within the transform attributes, modify, freeze transforms. And then I can come to skeleton, orient joint, and do the same thing as I did before. With this one, I had the other side going along the y-axis. Anyway, so I'll select the primary axis once again as X, secondary axis is Y. And if I select this, as you can see, currently it's not really working, so I'll hit apply. And there it goes down the chain with the X going down and the Y going up, so the same as it did on the opposite side. Down here on the leg, where I had the Z axis as the dominant one, I'll just have it set here and then hit apply. And so now the x-axis is once again pointing down and the z-axis is pointing forward. And so I've got these now oriented in the way that they need to be. So with that, I now have everything set up how it needs to be. Just as a final precautionary measure, select that core joint, modify, freeze transforms, make sure everything's good. A few of these, yeah. Anyway, so now that we've got the rig all put together and everything's ready, I'm now going to bind the mesh to the skeleton. And I'm actually leaving some stuff on here that's going to need to be taken care of, and I'm doing that on purpose. So you see there's some history here. The reason I'm doing this is so that I can show you how to delete if you need to. In general, I would normally clean this all up right now, delete the edges, make sure the history is deleted. And so that's best practice. The only reason I am leaving it on right now is just to show you how to do it if there's a case where you need to later. So what I'll do is I will select the mesh and the skeleton, and then I will come up here to skin, bind skin, and select the checkbox. Right now I'm good with 3 max influences and leaving everything else the same, and I will hit bind skin. And so once again, because now the skin is attached to the skeleton, it's changed color. When I select the skeleton, it's a different color. So now if I move things, you can see that there's actual movement within the object, but there's also a lot of distortion. So I'm going to step back. Same thing here. If I move this leg up, because especially that crossover I had with the geometry there, that's going to create some issues where I've got this horrible, awful stretching. Now, the way we resolve this stretching and the other issues related to it is by actually coming in, and we're going to start looking at how to paint weights. So that'll be the next step, and we will continue that with the next video.